What you're about to see is a dive of the Hydro Atlantic, a wreck off the coast of Florida in the United States, being done as a part of an advanced wreck diving course taught by John Chatterton and Alec Hutchinson. We are not professional divers, with the exception of the instructors. We are students, so along this dive we're going to make a bunch of mistakes, but hopefully we'll also do a bunch of smart or interesting things, which should teach you both about wreck diving, technical diving, and a little bit about how John Chatterton himself teaches diving. A lot of what you see may be what you expect or be common. Other things might be specific to how Chatterton teaches, and other things will just flat out be mistakes. Obviously, we're doing our best and we're learning, but this is the first dive that we've done that involves this kind of wreck penetration. So, any dive you survive. That was a joke. So what we're doing now is getting prepared on the boat to do our dive. We've arrayed all of our gear out. One of the things that we really got decent at in this trip was only bringing the gear on the boat that we actually needed. So we were pretty confident that we had everything. Chatterton also gave us a laminated checklist, which is something that we had been procrastinating on making for a long time, and it helped us not forget anything. Having a little checklist that we could just buckle onto something and then really go down and double check, made sure we had everything in the car, and then it made sure we had everything on the boat. The other big pro tip was obviously getting to the boat early so that we actually had time to get everything arrayed on, get all the gear configured, and not feel rushed. And that was really just waking up half an hour earlier than maybe we needed to so that we were sure we had time to get everything sorted out. You'll see one of us are diving in a dry suit. All three of us began this trip diving dry suits because all of our training has been in Monterey, California, where it's cold. The water's about 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Here, obviously, you can see on the bottom corner, the air temperature, at least, about 93. The water temperature is 10 degrees lower than that, but it's still very, very warm. So at this point, I think two of us had switched to about a 1.5 mil wetsuit in order to be more comfortable and not have to worry about the undergarments, because multiple days of diving in sweaty conditions, the undergarments, the cotton or synthetic warm fleece, basically, you wear underneath the dry suit, gets hard to wash and hard to dry. We didn't have laundry facilities at the hotel. So switching to wetsuit made everything much more easy and more comfortable. One of us had not made the switch yet. He was still contemplating his options. So you'll see him diving in a dry suit. Making the switch to a wetsuit is non-trivial because doing technical diving like this, you need to make sure you have redundant buoyancy. You have a second way of getting buoyancy if your BC were to fail for some reason. That becomes really important because we generally don't have ditchable weight. We can't release our weight into the ocean if we need to ascend for some reason. And that makes a lot of sense because when you're doing technical diving, when you have decompression obligations, you can't ascend over a certain depth without incurring a serious problem. You have to be able to control your depth and not ascend when you don't want to. That obviously required a lot of training for us and a lot of mishaps back in California. But it also means we don't want to be in a situation where we could accidentally drop weights. That would be very, very bad. So we don't have ditchable weights, and so we need redundant buoyancy. When you have a dry suit, that gives you that extra source of buoyancy because a dry suit actually has a hose that runs to your regulator, your first stage of your regulator, and it lets you add more gas into the suit itself so it doesn't crush you as you descend. A dry suit's like a sealed bag, and so as you descend, it would be easy for it to become like a plastic bag getting pulled down into the ocean and get it smaller and smaller in volume and crush you. So you have a hose connected to your regulator and a valve that lets you let air into the dry suit as you descend. When you lose the dry suit, you don't have that second source of buoyancy anymore. And so I had to switch to a two-bladder wing, a wing that has a second hole hose and a second hole bladder inside of it so that if my primary BC bladder were to fail for some reason, I could move my hose over and switch to that one. I also had to get these lovely little shorts that have pockets on them because I lost the pockets that would normally be in my dry suit. In those pockets, we keep a lot of backup gear usually. So I think in my left pocket, I had my backup surface marker buoy, which you inflate to give you a line up to the surface. You'll see that at the end of the dive, and a backup spool of line for it. And I also had a backup mask because when you're doing a technical dive, if you were to lose your mask for some reason or were to break, you could spend a lot of time in the water without one doing your required decompression. And so a part of all dive training is being able to take your mask off and put it on. But technical diving, you start doing that with more complications like distractions, doing it while holding onto a line, doing it while in a decompression obligation. And so carrying that backup mask becomes a really nice thing. I carry my primary spool and SMB in the other pocket, but you'll see the other divers have it clipped off in various places. The basic idea of deep diving, of decompression diving, is we're going to dive deep enough that nitrogen has entered our blood to a higher degree than is normally allowed during diving. And if we were to ascend rapidly to the surface, that nitrogen would literally bubble out. It would just like a pot of water boiling. And that would be very bad because bubbles flowing through your bloodstream cause all sorts of problems. And bubbles in other areas of your body cause pain and a lot of very serious issues. To prevent that, we gradually ascend. We make stops along the way to allow some of the nitrogen out in a controlled manner, such that by the time we get to the surface, we have released enough nitrogen that we can get to the surface safely. We do that by planning our dive very meticulously to make sure we have enough gas to do all the decompression stops. We used software called Multi-Deco to do that. And then by using dive computers, which you'll see on my wrists, which compute the amount of time that we're going to have to stop at different levels continuously and allow us to understand where we should be stopping, how much time we have, decompression obligation we call it, at every point of the dive, so that we can make good choices about when we're going to ascend and so that we don't violate the parameters of our dive. We actually program into the computer the level of conservatism that we're looking for. I believe this dive we're using 30 and 80, which are gradient factors. And what that says is we want our decompression to start when we have a gradient of 30. It's kind of an abstract quantity that represents how much nitrogen wants to get out of your blood. And that we're content to get out of the water when it's 80. I believe we don't actually get out of it in this dive until 60. We stay in there a little bit longer at 20 feet and at 10 feet to be even safer. But those are the numbers that we use in planning. Generally, 100 is considered the point that would be dangerous. So when we're talking about 80, that's a significantly safer number. Or at least it's a reasonably safe number that many technical divers would happily use. On our feet, you'll see some hard rubber fins. It's pretty common in technical diving to not use split fins or hybrid fins or anything like that. They're also relatively short so that we can maneuver inside the wreck. The solid fins allows us to use more complicated kicking mechanics like frog kicking, modified flutter kicking that are all about not lifting silt up off the bottom of the wreck. Any wreck or cave tends to accumulate a bunch of little dust that piles up as the super soft silt and can easily be kicked up and then totally black out any ability to see anything. So to prevent that, we keep our knees bent and we use a little bit of a different kicking technique that benefits from these hard fins. We also back kick from time to time, which is a way of kicking that moves us backwards in the water. That's really valuable, particularly when we're doing our deco later, so that we all can look at each other and remain in position even with a tiny bit of current. And the hard rubber fins helps a lot with that. We're using RK3s here, which are the best ones, I believe, at the moment, having tried and owned too many pairs. You'll see on my left side, I have an aluminum 72, a 72 cubic foot tank of nitrox. You'll see one on Harris, who's sitting to my right here as well. That tank is for our decompression. So it's a tank that has extra oxygen in it so that when we do our decompression, we're breathing a gas with less nitrogen and we can do that deco a little bit faster. So we bring it with us to accelerate our deco. From a safety perspective, we do all the math to make sure that our back gas, the big double tanks on our back, contain enough gas for us to do our entire decompression if we have to. But we don't put any real conservatism margin into that. So having the extra tank on our side allows us to get all the conservatism we want, such that we could handle, for example, someone else losing their back gas during the dive, and be able to have enough gas to manage that, to let them breathe off of our tank. It also accelerates our deco by breathing a higher oxygen mix when we're shallower in the water. We end up getting out of the water a little bit sooner. On this dive, I believe those tanks are full of 70. Which means it's 70% oxygen and 30% nitrogen. Normal air is 21% oxygen, about 79% nitrogen. So that will just accelerate our deco a little bit. On our backs, we're using steel 120s. So it's two 120 cubic foot tanks. That means it represents 120 cubic feet of air at, if it was not compressed. all compressed down into those tanks. And since we have 2 of them, we actually have 240 cubic feet. So it's definitely a lot of gas. It's exactly 3 times more gas than the traditional 80 that most people will train on when they're learning to scuba dive and will rent. The doubles are really valuable because it allows us to actually have 2 complete separate regulator setups. So we have 2 first stages and 2 second stages, and a manifold in between them that we can open and close. So during normal diving, one of our regulators is coming off of one, and one of our sources of buoyancy is coming off of one, and then the other regulator and maybe the other source of buoyancy, if it's hooked up, is coming off of the other one. And that way, if we were to have a failure, we can reach over our shoulders, turn off that valve, and it will isolate that first stage. Most of the time when you have a failure, it's actually not in the tank, it's in the first or second stage or the hose. So by being able to turn off the connection to one of those first stages, we can usually fix the problem, and because there's a manifold connecting the 2 tanks, still have access to all the gas. If there were a catastrophic problem in one of the tanks, we could also close the manifold and preserve the gas that was in the other tank. So that's there's been a lot of different experimentation over the years, and this is kind of the way that most technical divers have elected to set up double tanks if they're not diving side mount. Chatterton taught us something a little bit different than what we had learned in the past, which is to leave the isolator valve almost closed. Conventionally, you take all the valves and you open them up all the way, and that's really valuable for the regulator valves because it makes it a little easier to breathe. But with the isolator valve, since the connection is at the full tank pressure at 3,000 psi, and so little gas has to really pass through it. I guess the same volume of gas, but it's at such a high pressure. You're able to leave it almost entirely closed and have it work just as well. And by doing that, we can reach over our backs and just turn it once, twice, and immediately get it closed if we have to in an emergency. The other big advantage of that is if you turn it the wrong way, you'll actually know, because it's very easy to get disoriented when you're reaching over your shoulders and turn the valve the wrong way. But when it's almost closed, if you turn it more than twice and it doesn't stop turning, you know you're going the wrong way. So that gives you a little bit of an advantage. We were also taught in this course to close the isolator valve first in an emergency. If bubbles are emanating from behind us, we can't tell where. In other courses, we had been taught to close the side that we thought the bubbles were coming from first, but the instructors on this course had had emergencies in the past and had expressed that it wasn't really possible to tell where the bubbles were coming from, and that they thought it was wiser to get that isolation manifold closed so that the worst case scenario is only losing gas from one tank. So you'll notice that the setup we have here is a little bit different than in recreational diving. When you're doing recreational diving, you have kind of a jacket style BC, this thing that you put on like a jacket, zip up in the front, and it integrates all of your weight and your buoyancy into one nice thing, holds your tank in the back. Unfortunately, it's not perfect for technical diving for a few different reasons. In technical diving, we want things to be a little bit simpler. We also want things to be more reliable because we can't really handle, a zipper breaking or a piece of plastic breaking underwater. It's a bad situation. We can't go straight to the surface when we're doing technical diving. So we have this back plate and wing setup where we have a few different pieces that are all bolted together. In the back, you have the tanks that are held together with a thing called cam bands, those metal bands that hold them together. Then you have bolts that go through your wing, which is your lift device. It inflates and deflates to control your buoyancy, or you inflate it and deflate it. It doesn't do anything on its own. And that's available in different sizes. Most people with these big 120 doubles use a 60-pound wing. So when it's fully inflated, it gives 60 pounds of lift. That's what Harris is using here. But Chatterton actually uses a 45-pound wing, which requires having really good weighting. You can't be carrying too much in the water, but it really streamlines you inside of a wreck. And then in front of that, we have a stainless steel or aluminum back plate, which is really just a bent piece of metal that gives the whole thing structure and gives you a place to weave in nylon webbing that then becomes your shoulder straps and your waist strap and your crotch strap. And that holds it all onto your body. It takes a long time to get it configured properly. It took us months to get everything good and in such a way that we liked it. But once it is all set up, it's very reliable. There's no plastic that can break. And it's very simple. And it also puts all of the weight and all of the buoyancy above you when you're horizontal in the water. So it makes it really easy to stay horizontal, which is what you want to be when you're penetrating a wreck. You'll see the diver on the right there in pink fins. She's not a student. She was a former student who was accompanying us on the dive. She's using a rebreather, which is a more advanced system for being able to breathe underwater. And so she's going through all of the preparation required to get a rebreather set up. which I am utterly unfamiliar with. I have a light on the back of my right hand that you may have just seen. There are various lights that you can put on there, but I'm just wearing a pretty small one because it became clear in the course of this trip that was really all that was necessary. I regret a little bit not bringing a video light though, because when we start going inside the wreck, you'll notice that you can only really see the exact spot where a light is shining on the video, whereas we were able to see a little bit better. So now, this dive is not being done with an anchor line. So the boat has not locked onto the wreck with a line that we would follow in. Instead, the boat captain is using his GPS to get us right over the wreck. And then when he thinks we're right kind of up current from it, he's going to tell us to dive. And we're all going to, as quickly as possible, jump off the back of the boat. Or step off the back of the boat, rather. We have emptied all the air out of our BCs. We've actually put them to our mouths and sucked out any air that was in there. So we are as negatively buoyant as we can possibly get. And the reason for that is we want to drop really, really fast. Because if we drop too slowly, we will miss the boat. The current will take us right beyond the wreck that we're trying to find. When we're done with our dive, we're going to inflate SMBs, these inflatable little bags that will come up to the surface and give us lines that we can do our decompression off of, and then also alert the boat to where we are. And the boat will just kind of happily follow these SMBs until we come up, finishing our deco. And then the boat will pick us up. So it's going to follow us as we drift in the current. That's pretty common in Florida. It's not that common in other places. It works really well, particularly on a flat day like this with an observant boat captain. Or at least it worked very well for us. They seem to do pretty well. Alec, who's in front of me, is also diving a rebreather. That's a Revo rebreather, which is a system that I'm touching the truck bed coating he puts on it so that the wreck doesn't damage it. It allows him to rebreathe the same gas over and over, filtering out the CO2. So he can carry much less gas than we need to for the same length dive. Now I'm chatting with the dive master who'll make a cameo a little bit later. So now we're entering in the water, descending as quickly as possible. We're descending pretty deep, so we actually have a surprising amount of time. So this is where we're checking our valves. We're making sure that our tank valves are in the right position. With these types of dives, we didn't do really extensive buddy checks, you'll notice, which is a little bit different than what we've done in the past. But we found that there was sufficient time during the descent to confirm that the valves were in the position that we liked, that our secondary regulators worked, things like that. You'll also notice that we're kind of in these awkward pawing positions as we descend. When I pan over to Chatterton in a second, right there, you'll see he's in a truly perfect position where one leg is straight so that he's aerodynamic and the other is bent so that he can pivot. He can turn if he wants to. So that's kind of the dream, but we are not there yet. The wreck is just coming into view now at about 100 feet. And our goal is to take our tanks, our deco bottles, not the main tanks we're breathing off of, but the bottles we only need in order to ascend, and leave them in a certain spot in the wreck. In this case, it's the port side of the conning tower, which is where they would have piloted the ship. And so we're going to kind of get all coordinated and sorted out here, and then eventually get our bottles carefully laid down. I'm a little bit more negative than I wanted to be. You'll see I kind of need to use the tank to prop myself up for a second. And the reason that I'm more negative than I expected is because it takes a lot longer to fill your BC at this depth. Because the pressure is higher, the same amount of gas will not fill it as much. So even me holding down the button for a good amount of time just did not give me as much gas as I anticipated. So we're getting it all set up, and we'll put a strobe on it. We actually Chatterton had a strobe clipped onto his bottle already and turned on before he even left the boat, which is pretty smart. And that way, if the visibility was not as good as it is right now, it would help us find it later. Again, if we couldn't find them, we do have enough gas in our tanks on our backs to do a full decompression. But that isn't the plan that we want to follow. We want to follow the plan that gives us more contingency and gets us out of the water a little bit faster. Right now, Chatterton is kind of prompting us to do all the things that we should know how to do ourselves, but we're students and we're dumb. So he's holding up cards for things like check your secondary regulator, check your computers, make sure your buddies don't have huge columns of bubbles emanating off of them. And once we're kind of confident that all that stuff looks good, we'll be ready to make it to where we're going to penetrate the wreck. I have 2 computers, and actually we all have 2 computers. And the reason for that is, one, redundancy, because if we lose a computer, we still want to be able to know how long our decompression stop should be. The other is because I actually have different information on each one. That was another thing that Chatterton really taught us. I kind of use one for information I need on the bottom, like compass. And then the other is information that I need during deco. So things like what my current time to surface is, how long it'll take, how long it will take for me to get all the way to the surface, completing all of my deco stops at the current time of the dive, and if I stay at the current depth for 5 more minutes. So we have them slightly different in terms of how they're set up, which is not something that we had known to do in the past. I also have a slate on my wrist, and on that slate you'll see a bunch of numbers written. Those numbers represent 3 different variations of how the dive could go. One is our actual plan, and it's telling me what the runtime is. I misspoke there. The runtime is exactly the same for our plan. Our plan is to have a 62-minute runtime, meaning the descent, the time on the boat, and the time ascending is 62 minutes. That plan is built around the whole dive being at 165 feet. If we actually, so Chatterton is asking me to look at this broken up area of the ground here, just because he's going to show it to me again when we're inside the wreck. We're currently kind of proceeding down the port side of the wreck backwards, so we're heading towards the stern of the boat. And I'm following Leo, who's one of the students and is kind of the one leading us. He's going to go a little far in a second, so Chatterton will flash his light and tell him to come a little higher so that we can actually see where our entry point is. We didn't do a great job of using depth to navigate in this one, so we didn't notice that we were lower on the boat than we actually needed to be to see our entry point. The numbers represent different variations of our plan based on us not actually spending as long at our deepest depth as we plan on spending. So if we spend a little bit less time at the deepest depth, we're not going to accumulate as much nitrogen, and we're actually going to have more time on the wreck. So as we get closer, I'll start checking my computer, and I'll compare it to those plans, and I'll try to figure out which one is currently active, essentially, which one we actually have the most amount of time for, to make sure that we do come out of the water in 62 minutes. And generally, if we come out in the time that we plan, we'll have used the amount of gas that we planned. That's a technique that he taught us that allows you to get a little bit more time on the wreck than you would get strictly by following your bottom time that you plan. So these are the dog houses. They're referred to as that because they look like dog houses. They actually were windows, skylights that could be opened to cool the engine room. And so we're going to descend down through them on the port side and enter the engine room where there are 2 diesel engines. This boat, the Hydro Atlantic, was being towed to be decommissioned and accidentally sunk in a storm. So unlike a lot of the wrecks in Florida, it is an actual oopsies sunken wreck, not a intentionally cleaned wreck meant for divers. And so that means it has some more interesting stuff on it because it wasn't, sanitized for our purposes. So now I'm kind of awkwardly pirouetting my way down, maybe adjusting my buoyancy a little too slowly, so it takes a second or 2 longer than I'd like. And we're passing into the engine room. And so we'll be looking forward, and we'll see the 2 large diesel engines. And so this wreck course was all about being able to do essentially this, being able to safely penetrate wrecks. And so we spent a lot of time laying lines and following lines, although we won't do it on this dive, using blackout masks to simulate situations where we didn't have any visibility. This is kind of the part where it starts looking like Half-Life. The circling of light is the signal for okay. So he was asking if I was okay, and I was saying yes. And we spent a lot of time navigating our way through wrecks, studying plans, and trying to map that to how the wreck would actually line up. and also learning how to pass through restrictions. On this dive and a couple different places, we'll pass through some pretty small openings. And so it was very valuable to have someone as experienced as Chatterton there to kind of teach us what we're allowed to do. But it is totally okay to, squeeze your way through a little hole in a rusty boat. Chatterton spends a lot of time talking about CO2 narcosis. People really commonly talk about nitrogen narcosis, this idea that when you're at depth, like the depths we're at in this dive, the nitrogen in the gas tends to make you kind of drunk feeling. But he really emphasizes the idea that most of that effect probably comes from CO2 accumulation. He's done a lot of very deep dives on air, and his experience is that the harder you're breathing really maps to how narked you get. And if you're able to move very slowly, if you're able to pull and glide, where you grab features of the wreck like I am here, and as opposed to swimming, and use as little energy as possible, you can actually really avoid narcosis. And that was our experience on this dive. We were pretty deep for breathing air, and none of us are close to air. It was something like 23% oxygen, but that's very close to air. And none of us felt narked at all. So we've passed diagonally through the engine room, and so we're now heading towards the front of the ship along the starboard side. And you'll see me kind of checking both computers. That's not because there's any important reason to check both computers. It's because I was not really yet used to which I had on which screen, and so I would have to check both because I would be looking for a certain number. What's written on the slate is essentially at 3 different times during the dive what at +5 number I should be looking for. And at +5 represents what the total time it will take for me to get back up to the surface doing all my decompression will be if I was to stay at the current depth for 5 more minutes. So when I see the at +5 plus the run time of the dive, the total amount of time I've already elapsed, +5 equal 62 minutes, it means it's time to turn around. It means it's time to ascend, essentially, that I have 5 minutes before I'm gonna, it's the go time to ascend. Unfortunately, you would have to do that math in your head because Shearwater doesn't give us the run time +5, which would be very convenient, or the estimated run time, which would be even better. They don't support those features in their computers for some reason. So instead, we kind of do the math in advance and write down what the at +5 we should be looking for that will equate to all of that at our planned time that the dive should end, and then 2 minutes after that and 2 minutes after that. And so now we're passing through these areas that used to be a wall. That is the Elfin John Chatterton slipping through a hole very elegantly. I will do it a little bit more sloppily. You'll see my arms shoot out in front of me because that Superman pose is what we learned is most effective to get through a restriction. We're now passing, that was kind of a bulkhead. Now we've moved forward on the boat, and we're about to be in the dredging pit, essentially. The area where this boat, which was a dredger, would dump sludge. So we've passed underneath the hole that he pointed out earlier. We've passed underneath the conning tower where we placed our tanks, and we're now about to enter this open pit. And at that point, the next part of our dive plan is for one of us to place a strobe. I actually take over. This is the point where I'm diver 1. I've been diver 3 so far, the last one in the sequence of the 3 students. I take over at this point, and I will ask Harris to place a strobe in a certain hole that Chatterton has instructed us exists on this boat, where we will later see that strobe from the inside of a different part of the ship. You'll see me making various hand signals. That's the best way to communicate underwater because you can't really talk, although Chatterton has an amazing way of successfully communicating things using sometimes talking, which I didn't think really worked, but apparently it does, and sometimes miming, and sometimes making noises and posing. So yeah, I'm kind of maybe too rapid fire telling Harris to put the strobe there. Chatterton has to get it out and turn it on though. Strobes are used a lot in wreck diving because they allow you to find things, even in situations where you might have lost some visibility. So a part of our exercise was placing strobes down a hallway. Another was kind of recovering them and seeing all the different ways that you could place a strobe. It's usually used to mark where you left something or what your way out was. So if you're entering a wreck, you'll place strobes so that you can find each corner or turn that you made along the way. Obviously, it's only one of the many ways to navigate. You can't really trust that any given strobe isn't going to fail or that you'll be able to find it. But I asked Chatterton at a certain point, have strobes saved your life? Are there situations where you would be dead if you did not have a strobe there? He said, it has happened. Hopefully that we don't find ourselves in any of those situations. And I would guess he doesn't want to find himself in any of them at this point either, but a lot of experience. So we're all sort of hanging out. I'm scoping out the area that I'm going to lead us on because my job is, once the strobe is placed, my job is to take us up the front wall of this dredging pit and to this area called the coffin, because it kind of looks like a coffin. And at that point, Chatterton's going to show us a different way in and have us go that way. I was actually supposed to remain in charge for the whole period of going in and going down, but I essentially forgot about that, and I thought Harris was supposed to do it, so I signal that he will, and he's kind of confused, and then eventually figures it out and takes over. So that was my mistake. But right now, we're just leading all of us up this wall, and I'm trying to make sure everyone's successfully following me. And again, I'm trying to use my hands to move, which is a very foreign thing, because usually when you're dealing with coral diving, you don't want to touch the coral because it's not good for it. But with this type of diving where it's steel, you can, and it saves a lot of energy to just sort of grab and pull. Because this is Florida, it's very warm, and so the gloves that I'm wearing are just kind of basically construction gloves. It was so incredible to be on this ship and be able to just explore it. We were only actually on the boat for maybe 22 minutes of bottom time, but it just feels like so much longer. And it was so valuable having a plan in advance. So I kind of am about to signal to Chatterton like this is the coffin by sort of making a sleeping hand signal and putting my head to the side. Right there. And he's like, okay, good. Now follow me into the actual hole that we're supposed to use. And I go, oh no, Harris is doing it. And I was mistaken on that point. And so now he has to kind of realize that that's what we want. We're going to descend down some staircases inside there to try to essentially get to the other side of that hole where that strobe was left, and then we'll come out through that hole. And then again, yeah, that confusion is still being worked on. Yeah, one of the things you realize is that the thing that really slows down these dives that costs you time is confusion, is everyone not knowing what they're supposed to be doing. And we, I think, did a pretty good job of planning this in advance, but these little confusions still get you. I have a spreadsheet of about 27, a lot of things that we did very well, but also a lot of things that we needed to do better, or could do better in the future, rather. So that's Chatterton descending with his bat fins. And I'll be following him down the stairs. Another one of the things that we learned just through our experiences working our way through really tight stairwells is how valuable it is to stay close to the bottom. Because you have these big tanks on your back that can catch on things and hook on things. And so just staying close to whatever surface is below you buys you a lot. And again, I kind of wish that I had a video light, because it would make it a little easier for you to see what's going on. But it does add a nice ethereal, video game quality to not having. leading up to these few days of rec training, we had never so much as stepped foot on a rec. At least I had never gotten anywhere close to one. So it's amazing how much confidence he's able to give you in just a few days of diving. Because I think all of us on this dive felt like it was very simple. It was very calm. We knew what we were supposed to be doing. Everything went the way that it was supposed to go. You know, we've had dives in 30-foot deep lakes that were more stressful than this dive, which is, I think, very, it's a testament to his teaching style. And so now is when we really start checking the computers a little bit more frequently, because we're getting closer to the end of our bottom time. That thing hanging on the left is actually a fire hose that's hanging down. I'm not entirely sure what this room is. It's clearly a very large sort of utility or storage room. I think it's the forward. You're actually seeing the walls of the ship itself. So maybe this would be used for storage or ballast or something. I'm not a world expert on boats, unfortunately. I asked Chatterton at the end of the course, if he had 2 more days with us, what would he teach us? And I kind of expected him to say, here's how you go through a triangular opening, or, I would teach you how to take your tanks off and push them in front of you to get into smaller holes. But he actually said research. He would teach us how to research shipwrecks. Just kind of interesting. So now he's kind of asking questions, and the reason he's asking these questions, I think, is twofold. One is to make sure that we're actually paying attention to things like what our at+5 is that we talked about earlier. The other is to teach us to check these things. By asking them, he makes sure that we know where on the computer you can actually see that number, and that we're supposed to be looking at it frequently. So this is the hole. Harris has already retrieved the actual strobe, so I never actually saw it, but he did. So I'm going to do another little Superman maneuver here to get out through that small hole. So much of the penetration stuff, there's a lot of technique to it, but a lot of it is just having someone give you permission to really go through these little tiny holes and realize that you can do it safely. A lot of it is also gear setup, making sure that you're streamlined and that you don't have anything connected in such a way that if it banged on something, it would be a big problem. So I make 2 hand signals there that kind of make sense to me, clapping and okay. I make another one of hold, and I have no idea why I do that. No, it does not make sense. So Leo now is starting to communicate to me that he thinks we're at our +5, that we have 5 minutes to go up. And so I compare it to the numbers that I have written. And unfortunately, I ascend a little bit while I'm doing that because I'm not paying attention. We eventually successfully communicate, yeah, we have to go up in 5 minutes. Luckily, the whole rest of the crew is already on their way to getting the tanks, so everybody's on the same page. And so we'll pass back up out of this dredging pit again, and that will be the conning tower where we left our deco bottles. Or at least hope so. Let's find out. I'm filming this on a Paralens camera, which I bought in Florida, and I'm very thankful that I did, because I was very, very happy in the subsequent days to have this video and be able to watch it, both because it's very exciting and because we were able to learn a lot from it. And it's nice because unlike a GoPro, it's waterproof naturally. You don't have to put it in a little case and deal with all that stuff. And it has the nice overlay of depth as well. So the next step after we get these deco bottles clipped on is to inflate our SMBs. So each of us are going to take out a rolled up SMB, and we're going to use gas to inflate it. Eventually, after we ascend a little bit, we're going to send it up to the surface with a line attached to it. And then we'll have a nice line to hang from while we do our deco. And again, my buoyancy there is a little low. Chatterton's technique for doing this is just fantastically different than anything that we learned anywhere else, and it makes so much more sense. He has a special way of rigging the spool so it has a ring on it, and rigging that SMB itself so it doesn't have any Velcro. So you just kind of pull the bungee cord off of it, and the whole setup is already rigged. There's no kind of looping anything through anything else or attaching anything to anything, or you don't have to disconnect the spool so it can unroll in order to get a line anywhere. It's all rigged already, ready to go, still clipped off. We also fill it from our BC. So we fill it from the buoyancy source on our back. We don't fill it from the tank. And the advantage of doing that is it keeps us neutrally buoyant even as we fill it, and it prevents us from having to switch to our regulators to get our other regulator available to fill the SMB. So you end up getting just kind of the right amount of gas in there. It only needs to be about a quarter full or a fifth full at this depth, because that gas will inflate as the SMB goes up. And I remain the whole time perfectly neutrally buoyant, ready to go. And the SMB remains close to me. The spool remains clipped off. I think the whole thing took about 20, 25 seconds. Much better than any of the other techniques that we had tried in the past. We're going to keep that clipped off. We're not going to send it off to the surface from this depth. We tried that once before the class, and what ended up happening is it went off diagonally in the current, and we ended up following it far away from the wreck, swimming like crazy to try to get back to the SMB. It was a mess. What we do instead is ascend to our first deco stop. And when we get about 10 feet away from our first deco stop, we release the spool and we let the line pay out and the SMB rise. And that makes us slightly negatively buoyant, because now the SMB isn't lifting us up anymore. The gas we put in the SMB isn't really lifting us up nearly as much anymore. And so we end up leveling off right perfectly exactly at our first eco stop. Once we start ascending, we want to ascend pretty quickly, because while we're down at depth, we're still accumulating more nitrogen. And so we want to get off the ship as quickly as we can, get to that point where we're no longer on-gassing nitrogen, and get up there. Now, fortunately, we started this whole process having 5 minutes still at depth, and so we have plenty of time. I'll let people sort out their gear issues and start to ascend. We really carefully looked at our depth on our computer. One of the other things that we did as a part of the class is all sit around and look at the output of our dive computer data on a big screen and look at exactly what our profiles were for the different dives and kind of compare it to how quickly we should be descending, how quickly we should be ascending. The other thing he really taught us is to try to hit our deco stop numbers exactly. There's a big tendency to try to stay a few feet below them because they're kind of this magical ceiling that has all this, scary impact if you go above it. But what he talked about is the idea that if we really are concerned about the depth of that ceiling, we can always adjust our gradient factor and make those ceilings more conservative. Instead, we should be trying to hit those numbers exactly, and we should cut the corners even, use the ceiling readout on our dive computer, which shows us exactly what the ceiling is, as opposed to round it up to the nearest 10 feet, and use that to really cut those corners so that we're never too close to the actual decompression ceiling, but we're also not needlessly spending more time at a greater depth than we're supposed to be at. Really trying to get our depth numbers to tightly fit the actual decompression ceiling that we have to follow. And that makes a lot of sense, because if you do want to be more conservative, you can always just adjust the gradient factors. There's no reason to get sloppy. So here I release the SMB, so it's now spinning and releasing it up, and I should level off right at 60 feet, which is my first deco stop, if the system works. And since I'm only releasing it from about 60 feet, the SMB is going to go pretty much straight up. It's not going to really get dragged a ton in the current, so it makes everything much easier. And then the real mission of the rest of the dive is just to follow each of these deco stops, using the computer to see what the ceiling is, and as we get close to, as the ceiling ticks within a foot or two of the next depth, kind of start that ascent. Try to follow it a little bit so that we don't overshoot our greater depth numbers. My deco gas becomes safe to breathe at 40 feet. You can't breathe it deeper than that because the quantity of oxygen is too high to breathe at greater depth. The body is sensitive to too many oxygen molecules being in the gas, and as we get deeper, each breath of gas has more molecules in it because the regulator has to deliver enough pressure to let you breathe at those higher and higher depths. And so we wait until we get to 40 feet, but I'm starting to prep. This is another thing we learned during the course, kind of tightening up our deco diving a lot, getting that gas prepped. This is another example of us learning something a little different than we were normally taught. We were taught to do a very regimented deco where every step is getting shown between a bunch of different people to verify it. And this system was a little bit more self-reliant, a little bit more focused on using your buddies to assist you, but not being dependent on them. Makes a lot of sense for this kind of drift diving where you can be far away from people. And so I'm getting the tank set up. I'm verifying that it is the right tank. I only have one, but it's a good habit. I'm getting the regulator in a place where I can use it, and then I will switch to it. I'll switch my computers to it, and then I will have someone take a look at my computers in the tank to make sure that it's all correct. But I'll do that after the switch. And the logic behind that is that in this type of situation, you could safely breathe the wrong gas for a few breaths, and you would not be seriously harmed. And it also means that when your buddy does verify, they're verifying it correctly because you're actually breathing off of it. They're not verifying whatever regulator you happen to be holding in that moment. It was very liberating to be able to be responsible for your own diving and really nail all of the switches and depth changes in a way that it was very difficult when we were trying to do it all in such a regimented fashion. But it did not feel any less safe. It actually felt more safe because it felt like there was a lot more situational awareness and decision making going on, and a lot less process. So now I'm at 40 feet, so I should be switching my gas, and I'll have to tell my computers that I'm breathing this other gas because all of my deco planning and scheduling is based on which gas I'm currently breathing. You'll see that primary regulator is on a really long hose. Another part of technical diving is entering into restricted environments like caves. And so it's common to have your primary regulator on a hose that's long enough to allow two people to share gas while they're moving single file, maybe through a small restriction in a cave or a wreck. That wasn't something that Chatterton does necessarily, but it is a common technical diving setup. Your other regulator is usually bungeed around your neck to make it easy to access. So here you'll see one of us drop a spool, which would normally be a problem, but in this case is kind of cool because they get to use a clever technique for retrieving it. So the spool is currently kind of unspooling itself, to use the verb, all the way down to the bottom of the ocean, whereas the other end is still attached to the SMB. So what they're actually going to do is make kind of a pulley out of their fingers, make their fingers into a ring, and clip a light onto one side, and the light will fall, lifting up the spool. Eventually, the spool will return to them, and they can start respooling the line, respooling the line, respooling the line, and eventually, when they get all the line, they'll have the light as well. So it's kind of a clever technique that we also learned as a part of this. And I just checked Harris's tank and his computers. Alec, the instructor, had checked mine right when the spool situation happened. I'm starting to get close to the point at which my depth is going to change to 30 feet. And so my ceiling right now, the number that I actually am trying to stay below, is maybe 31. And so I'm going to start kind of ascending and get a little bit closer to that 31 number, so that when it does tick down to 30, I can be there already. I don't waste a bunch of time at a depth lower than my actual deco obligation. That sounds like a trivial optimization, but when we looked at the profiles, we find that it does actually significantly change your runtime. And it is very satisfying to have your profile line up with the deco ceiling more closely. On my right computer, if you have very good eyes, you'll see that there's an area that's been red the entire dive. That's called the surf GF, the surface gradient factor. It's saying if I transported myself to the surface right now, what would my gradient factor be? And as we talked about before, any number over 100 would be a medical problem or potential medical problem. So the computer, once the number gets over 100, it just shows it as red. But during a decompression dive, it's going to be red a lot of the time. It's kind of inconvenient that they don't have a setting that lets you turn that off. Because while we have a deco obligation, of course, that number will be over our high gradient factor all the time until we finish our deco. So they're kind of finishing the spool retrieval process. They did end up following their deco profile pretty well, so they are ascending appropriately. And a big mission during the deco is just to try to move as little as possible. Hopefully you have appropriate thermal protection so that you're not cold. You don't have to move. And by not moving, you just use less gas. And that's great because then you have, less gas required. We spent a lot of time during our first few dives computing what our gas requirements were, how much we breathed. Obviously, as we move less, we need to emit less CO2 from our body. We need to get rid of less CO2, and so we don't need to breathe as much. And that is great because we spend a lot of energy and effort carrying these giant tanks on our back. It's very convenient when we don't have to use them up as quickly. Lets us plan longer dives. And so you see Alec down there just patiently spooling up the spool, and Chatterton handed off his SMB to the student in question to allow him to continue his ascent. You see the kind of rust that accumulated on those Velcro straps. After this dive, I replaced the Velcro with a bungee because it just sits closer to the arm, but it is kind of cool seeing rust from the wreck on dive gear. And so, yeah, the mission here is to kind of stay horizontal, be able to see everyone, move as little as possible, maintain the right depth, and stay a little negative on the spool, on the SMB. Pull the SMB down a little bit. And that's great because it keeps the SMB vertical on the surface, so it's easier for the boat to see. But it's also great because it just makes it easier to hold depth. If you're a little negative and you're pulling down on the line. And so this is an example of where I kind of started that early ascent a little too soon, and so it didn't quite clear, and so I had to hang out for an extra minute at about 25 feet or 24 feet. My ceiling here is probably just 21, so I could safely go all the way to 21, but I can't get up to that 20-foot stop just yet. There it is. And again, the computer, is flashing red, telling me that I violated that deco stop because I went above 30. But I wasn't within, feet of my actual ceiling. And right now it'll happily let me sit at 20 when my ceiling is 20, so it's a little silly. And it would be better if it only flashed red if you actually went above your true ceiling. There is something to be said for doing stage decompression. There is some evidence that stopping every 10 feet is more efficient, but it isn't dangerous as long as you're below your ceiling. So now we're hanging out at 20. Each of these stops progressively get longer as slower tissue compartments have to deco, and as the pressure gradient between what's in your blood and what you're breathing just gets smaller. the actual deco is surprisingly not boring. You'd think hanging out for many minutes would be as boring as it probably is for you to watch it. But in practice, it's meditative. You're looking around, you're doing interesting things. You're watching your buoyancy. You're watching your computer. It's calm, but it's not boring. I think I'm now signaling what my deco obligation is, how much time I have left. It's kind of filling time. And yeah, there really was no part of this dive where we were in any way bored. The prevailing feeling at the time is really that you don't want it to end, because then you have to get out of the water. And after spending time on that wreck, it's the last thing you want to do. Chatterton is a fan of making his deco bottles somewhat distinct from his main regulator, so he likes to use the different colored hoses, different colored regulators, different mouthpieces. Obviously, none of that is sufficient, but it's all just giving you one more little hint that you might be breathing off the wrong regulator. A lot of what he talks about is this idea that diving should be easy. That there's me pushing Harris away to get a little bit more room. That it's not a game of trying to make it as brutally difficult as possible, for many reasons, including CO2 accumulation. It's really a game of trying to make your diving easy, simple, trivial, not complicated. Make equipment modifications, make technique modifications, do whatever you have to make diving not hard. Give you the best possible chance of having as much capacity available as is possible to deal with an issue by making your normal diving full of as few of them as possible. And it seemed very effective for us. We had a very calm dive. So yeah, sometimes you'll see us thinning, which is unfortunate, because generally you obviously use finning to move around, but we want to be not wasting energy, not accumulating CO2 during our deco. We should just be using our buoyancy to maintain that. But again, we are students. Recording it was a fantastic thing, because it really let us look at all of these moments 100 times and understand what we could do better over the subsequent weeks and months. It made the time much more effective. It's amazing how little of this we really would have been able to recall from a single hour-long experience if we hadn't had the recording. And so this is really the ideal position that we're finally getting into now, where we're all head-to-head, we're well-positioned to help anyone in an emergency, we can communicate. It requires a little bit of that back finning, because at least one of us is always going to be being pushed with the current into the other people. But it's a great opportunity to practice that finning technique, because you got nothing but time. So at this point, I follow my computer and I make the ascent up to 10 feet. What I had forgotten is, and I guess the theme of this video is me forgetting things, what I had forgotten is that we had agreed that we were going to discuss essentially whether we're going to make the 10-foot stop or not, or whether we would just stay at 20 feet. When you're breathing nitrox, when you're breathing a gas that lets you do accelerated deco, you can safely do your last deco stop just staying at 20 feet. You don't actually have to ascend to 10, because you can still maintain enough of a pressure gradient even at 20 that you can pretty efficiently finish your deco. And so you can safely do that if there was a lot of current, or a lot of chop, really, a lot of waves, it would make a lot of sense to do that. That's the dive master making sure we're okay, that we don't need gas or anything like that. They don't always do that, but sometimes they like to get into the water. You can make your deco stop at 20 feet. There's no particular reason you have to go up to 10 if you have an accelerated deco gas, and it can be much more choppy at shallower depths. So this is me realizing, I guess we didn't decide that we wanted to go up to 20, up to 10, and so I'm paying outline and going back down to 20 to confer with the gentleman. And ultimately, what we decide is to stay at 20 until we clear our actual deco obligation, and then once it's fully clear, we'll go up to 10 just to practice a little bit. The day ended up being so calm that there was no problem at all. But you know, we are not, and we're not the most experienced deco divers in the world, and so it was nice for us to have a little bit more of a buoyancy safety margin, because it gets progressively harder to hold your buoyancy the shallower you are. So that's Leo saying no 10-foot stop, basically. And I'm saying, okay. That appears to be kind of an uncomfortable regulator configuration for Harris on the left. It seemed like it was dragging him down. There's a lot you can do around using the right length hose and putting swivels on and putting right angles on and putting bungees on to hold the tank closer to the back plate, things like that to make it more comfortable. But since we were borrowing these deco regs, we hadn't really done any of it. You don't generally put multiple deco regs on a deco bottle. You don't air share from a deco bottle because it's generally not necessary. Both because we all carry enough back gas to fully complete our deco if we have to. So it's just a safety thing. And because you could pass the tank back and forth every 10 minutes or every 5 minutes if you really wanted to share from a deco bottle, then it would work just fine. You know, we should never end up in a situation where we don't have a source of back gas, and so we need to survive off of the deco bottle. That would be a colossal failure of planning. We plan the dive with using about 60% of our gas for the bottom, and the time that we intend to spend on the rack, the actual gas we intend to breathe, and that leaves us 40% as a contingency. And what Chatterton taught was that we should use 40% because you can't really breathe the last 10% out of a tank. If we're starting at maybe 3,000 psi, most regulators won't let you breathe, below 300, 200, 150, something like that. And so we save 10% for kind of the share that we can never breathe. And then that last 30% means that at the worst possible point in the dive, at the deepest possible point, we could always air share and have enough gas for 2 people to get out on 1 person's back gas. Alternatively, we also run a plan to make sure any one of us could do our complete deco schedule just on that back gas. And so yeah, now we're hanging out. I mean, luckily we didn't have any major equipment failures, because that can really make you miserable. You know, if a dry suit is leaking, if you're cold, if something's uncomfortable, if your trim is off and you're just having to fight to stay horizontal, that can really make this stuff suck. But when everything works, it's just beautiful to be able to just lay in the water. You see those strobes kind of vaguely floating there. That particular model of strobe, which is the Tech 6, I think it's the one that Chatterton primarily favors. He actually gave each of us one as a part of the course, which was pretty nice. They're neutrally buoyant, so you can kind of clip them somewhere or leave them somewhere, and they'll basically just float. So he's now checking our computers, essentially to confirm that we have cleared our deco. He's looking at the tissue graph and confirming that we are clear and safe. I think we had cleared at this point. And that's just him being an instructor and making sure that we're not doing anything dumb. The shear water is really, I know I complain about we did a fist bump there, but I actually fist bumped him with my light, which I will forever regret, missing my Chatterton fist bump opportunity. You also got a good look at one of his many knives he carries. The Shearwaters, I know oh, hey, Leo. He's looking at the camera. I know I said some negative things about them, but the truth is they're 1,000 times better than any other technical diving computer. They really are. Well, at least any other diving computer. I shouldn't say that about technical ones, because there are some nice technical diving manufacturers, but they really are very well engineered computers for our purposes. I think they're actually required on Chatterton's course. He'll lend you them if you don't have them. You noticed there, when I was talking to Leo, I realized that his mask strap was actually in front of his Paralens camera, and it ultimately turned out that it got in the way of basically recording the entire dive. This is the point at which his dive recording begins, so it was good that I had a camera as well. So that's Leo asking me how much deco time I still have, and I signal back 5 minutes. And I think he signals 6. Actually, no. I signal 6 and he signals 7. So this will progress in this way for the next several minutes, and I will leave you to watch it, I think, without narration or voiceover. The closing statement that I would make is it was an incredible week. We learned a lot of techniques that I've just never seen in any book. And I've, read a fair number of them. And so it was beyond worth the time, beyond worth the money. It was one of the most amazing experiences, period. Everyone involved was just so thankful that we did it and that it worked out. And we were not the most experienced divers in the world by any means. We just barely gotten DECO certified coming into this, so we didn't have to be. They knew what they were doing. And he is just a fascinating, John Chatterton is just a fascinating and amazing character and human. The closest thing that I would link him to is someone like Richard Feynman, if I had had a chance to meet him. And so it was a bizarre and incredible life privilege to get to spend a few days with him at all. It was incredible.